Boy, it's good to see everybody tonight. And I'll tell you what I want to talk about a little bit is a couple years ago I preached here about forgiveness. And after I got through preaching, a guy came down out of the audience. He didn't continue to go to church here very long after that. But what he told me was he didn't see any. Well, if I'd have kept preaching, he probably would have still been here. But he went for a little while after that, and then he quit coming. But he told me that he didn't see any way in the world that Jesus could forgive him for what he had done. He had killed 2 teenagers in Germany. He had shot them. And what had happened was he was in the military, and he was working at a check station, and these young teenagers came driving up. They had actually robbed a store and killed somebody there, and when they got to the checkpoint, they tried to run it, and they stopped them. They got out, they killed the other guard that was there with him. They wounded him, and he killed 2 of them. And it weighed on his mind. Scotty and I both talked to him, and the guy was just totally distraught, and he didn't understand how Jesus could forgive him for what he had done. And I don't know how many of you have been in that situation where you just have done something and you just don't see how Jesus can forgive you. How can anybody possibly forgive me for what I've done? But that's what this sermon's about tonight. Don't think you're special. Jesus has forgiven people ever since he came to earth. Ever since he was crucified. He died for our sins. He died for everybody's sins. And I want to tell you a story of 3 people. And the first one, he was born into a poor family, but he was adopted. And he was adopted out to a rich family. And he grew up in this rich family, but then he got to know his folks, and he got to know the people that were from his old neighborhood, and they were all poor, but they worked for rich people. And he didn't like the way they were treated. And one day he was down there watching one of the bosses, and he started beating on one of them. Well, this guy looks around and makes sure nobody's watching, and he goes over and he kills the guy. And then he takes him out and he buries him and hides him. And then he leaves the country. So he's a murderer. The next guy, I guess you could say he was kind of a window peeper, because he was watching his neighbor's wife, and he saw her taking a bath. And he really thought she was really pretty. And actually, it not only was it his neighbor's wife, but it was somebody that worked for him. His wife. And he decided he really wanted her for himself, so he sends a note to her saying he wanted to see her. So she comes over to his house, and the next thing you know, she's pregnant. Well, this scares the guy, because in the country that they live in, if you get caught cheating, you get executed. And he knew that they were going to get caught, because with her being pregnant, and her husband was away on another project he'd sent him to, and he knew that there was no way he was going to be able to blame it on the husband. So he calls the husband back to town and says, "How's things going on the job?" So his employee tells him, he says, "Well, I'll tell you what, you've done a good job. Why don't you go home, spend some time with your wife?" See, what he's trying to do is set it up so it looks like the husband got her pregnant. And he says, "I can't do that. Those guys are down there, they're risking their lives on that project. I can't do that. I can't do that to my men." So he goes back. And so what does this guy do? The guy that got the other man's wife pregnant, he calls in one of the guys that's over this project, and he says, "I want you to put him in a really dangerous place to work. And the guy says, well, he'll get killed if he tries to do that. And he goes, that's okay. And he ends up getting killed. And then, so this guy ends up marrying the woman. So now everything's okay, he thinks. So now you got a guy who's a liar. He covets his neighbor's wife. He's an adulterer and he's a murderer. And the last guy I want to tell you about is somebody who he worked for the government. And he went around the country. They didn't like religious people, especially a certain type of religion. And basically what he did was, it was his job to round them all up and persecute them and execute them and torture them and kill them. And he did that for several years. Now, as it turns out, all three of these guys are actually heroes in the Bible. The first one was Moses, the second one was King David, and the third one was Paul. You see, they weren't what you would call good people when these things were going on. But you see, the thing is, it doesn't seem like He really likes to use righteous people, because God does things to glorify God, not to glorify man. And the thing about it is, when it gets right down to it, there aren't any righteous people. That's what the Bible tells us. Paul said, none of us are righteous. No, not one. The only way we're righteous is through the Lord Jesus Christ. And you see, the thing is, if God can use those people, what gives you the right to use an excuse of He's not going to be able to use me because I've done some bad things in my life? Well, let me tell you, you haven't done anything bad enough to keep God from being able to use you and to fix you. There is no way that that is possible. He can heal anything that you've done. But you have to turn your life over to Him. And the problem is, a lot of times we use an excuse that I've done bad things in my life and God won't use me. But He will. Okay, now I'm ready to start preaching.
Oh my.
Scotty does that all the time. I'm going to be preaching out of a couple of places. One of them is Proverbs chapter 6, starting with verse 16. I'm only going to be in it briefly, and then I'm going to go to Daniel. And what I'm going to read in Daniel is chapter 4, starting with verse 19. Proverbs 6:16 says, there are 6 things the Lord hates. No, 7 things He detests. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that kill the innocent, a heart that plots evil, feet that race to do wrong, a false witness who pours out lies, a person who sows discord in a family. You see, even though God hates those things, He will still use people that have done those things. So just like with Moses, David, and Paul, He can use you. If you've done some things in your life that you're not proud of, that you're ashamed of, it doesn't make any difference. If you'll turn your life over to God, He'll use you. The thing that you need to be aware of is the sins that I just talked about are all obvious sins. They're sins that people see all the time. They're easy to identify. If I commit one of them, I know it right away. I know that I've sinned. But there are sins that we commit that we don't recognize. We don't see. And the very first one that Proverbs talks about is haughty eyes, which is really pride. You see, here's the thing about pride is, it's really easy to recognize in you, but I'll never see it in me. That's the way pride is. Pride tells me I'm right, you're wrong. Pride is what got Satan cast into hell. are cast out of heaven. You see, what pride is, the definition of pride is having a high opinion of oneself. And it's the first of the 7 deadly sins. And haughtiness is arrogance or looking down on other people. And the thing is, we don't see that in other people, or we don't see that in ourselves, but we see it in other people. And that's where we have the problem with that type of sin, is that we don't even realize that we're committing it. And that's where we really have to turn to Jesus for help. Proverbs 11:2 says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. 13:10 says, pride only breeds quarrels. I've seen that so much where, two people bull up. My wife bulls up all the time. I can see her pride. It's so easy. And one thing I've learned is, whenever I figured out that I've actually lost the argument, pride tells me fight on no matter what, and fight twice as hard. And that's what I do. And that's what we all do. Once we fight, that's why it doesn't do any good to argue with somebody about politics or religion. If you prove them wrong, they're just going to argue twice as hard. They're never going to accept that they're wrong. It's the pride in them that causes them to do that. So I've learned the best way to get somebody to see your side is start agreeing with them until they see your side of it. I mean, if you start agreeing with people, it gets them on your side. It's hard to argue with somebody that's standing there agreeing with you.
Yeah.
It really is. And once you start that dialogue between each other and get pride out of the way, then it becomes easier and easier to have a conversation and to get down to what the problem really is. That's why pride is such a bad thing. That's why God doesn't like prideful people.
Yeah.
He loves us all, but boy, I'll tell you what, when you start letting pride interfere with things, pride is what leads to all these other sins. It tells you it's okay because you're right, they're wrong. It's okay to do what you want to do to them because you're right and they're wrong. See, pride is an inward belief, and it's not recognizable to you, even though other people see it all the time. But let me tell you what pride does to people. Turn to Daniel 4:19. I thought I had this marked, but I guess I didn't. If I can find it. And this is, Daniel's talking to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Upon hearing this, Daniel, also known as Belshazzar, was overcome for a time, frightened by the meaning of the dream. Then the king said to him, Belshazzar, don't be alarmed by the dream and what it means. Belshazzar replied, I wish the events foreshadowed in this dream would happen to your enemies, my lord, and not to you. The king you saw was growing very tall and strong, or the tree you saw was growing very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. It had fresh green leaves, was loaded with fruit for all to eat. Wild animals lived in its shade, and birds nested in the branches. That tree, your majesty, is you. For you have grown strong and great. Your greatness reaches up to heaven, and your rule to the ends of the earth. Then he saw a messenger, a holy one, come down from heaven and say, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze and surrounded by tender grass. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals of the field for 7 periods of time. This is what the dream means, your majesty, and what the Most High has declared with will happen to my Lord the King. You will be driven from human society, and you will live in the fields with the wild animals. You will eat grass like a cow, and you will be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. But the stump and roots of the tree were left in the ground. This means that you will receive your kingdom back again when you have learned that heaven rules. King Nebuchadnezzar, please accept my advice. Stop sinning and do what is right. Break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. You see, King Nebuchadnezzar, his real sin was pride. He thought he was better than everybody else. But all these things did happen to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, he was taking a walk on the flat roof of the royal palace in Babylon. As he looked out across the city, he said, "Look at this great city of Babylon. By my own mighty power, I have built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor." He really thought he was something, what he had done. And Daniel had just got through telling him, the only reason you have all this stuff is because the Lord gave it to you. And if he decides to take it away, it's gone. But Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's in charge. While these words were still in his mouth, a voice called down from heaven, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, this message is for you. You are no longer ruler of this kingdom. You will be driven from human society. You will live in the fields with the wild animals, and you will eat grass like a cow. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses." That same hour the judgment was fulfilled, and Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society. He ate grass like a cow, and he was drenched with the dew of heaven. He lived this way until his hair was as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. Now, how many times has that happened to us? You think you're on top of the world, and all of a sudden your world just comes crashing down. It's happened to me before. I remember sitting one time at an intersection thinking, man, when I was saved, I knew I was saved. There was no doubt in my mind. I was 12 years old and was down at Riverdale Baptist Church. And it was such a strong emotional event that I knew if I didn't get in front of that church and ask the Lord to forgive me and accept Him as my Savior, I was going to die. And I was saved that day. But as a lot of people do, I drifted away from the Lord. And I started thinking I was pretty hot stuff back whenever I was younger, and I thought everything I had was because I had worked for it and I'd got it on my own, not realizing that it was what the Lord wanted me to have. And I remember sitting at an intersection and thinking, man, my life is really great. I just don't know how things could be so good. And that very afternoon, my world really got turned upside down. I had a son who had to go into the hospital, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. And this went on for almost 2 months. And as it turned out, he had a tumor in his spinal canal and had to have surgery. But it was just one of those things where when you think you're on top of the world, that's when you got to, and you think it's because you put yourself there, that's when you need to be careful, because that's pride talking to you. You need to realize that God is the one who helped you get there. I mean, you have to put out some effort to get there, but God is the one who really helps you.
Yeah, right.
After this time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven. My sanity returned, and I praised and worshipped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. His rule is everlasting, and His kingdom is eternal. All the people of earth are nothing compared to Him. He does as he pleases among the angels of heaven and among the people of the earth. No one can stop him or say to him, "What do you mean by doing these things?" When my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as head of the kingdom, with even more honor than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud. And that's exactly what he did to Nebuchadnezzar. You see, the sins that we can see, the ones that Moses and David and Paul committed, those are the ones that are easily fixed. But it's the sin of pride that really causes us a problem. And it really interferes with our relationship with the Lord. And that's why it's so important. In fact, I would ask people here to hold up their hand if they had a problem with, if they thought they had a problem with pride. And the interesting thing is, it would be the people who didn't hold up their hands that would be the ones that had the problem. Because you don't recognize it. If you know you've got a problem with pride, you're on the road to recovery. And it's the people that don't know it. The people who think everybody else is wrong and everybody else has got the problem. If you feel that way, you've got a problem with pride, and it'll come between you and the Lord sooner or later. You need to get it out of your life. And the best way to do that is ask the Lord for help. Because He'll help you. So I guess what I'm saying to you tonight, when it gets right down to it, is no matter what you've done, no matter how bad you think you've been, you haven't been bad enough that the Lord can't save you and the Lord can't use you. He will use you. If you'll turn your life over to Him, He'll use you. He'll put you to work. If you're here tonight and you haven't accepted Jesus, my prayer tonight is that tonight would be the night that you would accept Him and let Him help you. Turn your life over to Him. And I can't stand up here and tell you that once you turn your life over to the Lord, everything's going to be great, because it won't be. You'll still have the same trials and tribulations that everybody else has, but you'll have somebody that you can turn to and you can lean on and you can tell your troubles to, and they'll help you. The Lord will help you. He'll help you get through all this.